Our speaker today, Peter Cavanagh, is the guest curator of our new exhibit, How Birds Fly. His interest in bird flight originates from his love of nature, his professional training in biomechanics, his background as an instrument-rated private pilot, and his passion for photography. This exhibit brings all of these elements together in an effort to explain the mysteries of bird flight to our museum patrons. Peter has traveled widely in pursuit of interesting birds, including trips to Alaska, Australia, Botswana, Brazil, Canada, Japan, the Galapagos Islands, the Netherlands, Patagonia, and Iceland. Several of the photographs in the exhibit were taken on Lopez Island, here in Washington, in the Salish Sea's San Juan archipelago, and where Peter and his wife, artist Anne Vandervelde, spend much of their time. His work has won awards in the U.S. and Canada, and has been featured by the Audubon Society, the American Ornithological Union, and can be seen in the permanent collection on board the new Washington State Ferry, the Samish. His book, How Birds Fly, will be published in 2016. We're excited to have him here today. Please help me welcome to the stage Peter Cavanagh.
Thank you, Cale. Cale, thank you. Well, it's a real pleasure to see so many people giving part of their Saturday afternoon to see the fruits of the labor of many people over the last 18 months. And I want to start there by thanking a number of people. First, I have to start with Chris Melander. Chris is the director of exhibits here at the museum, and I approached Chris. I was just a walk-on off the street about 18 months ago, and I said, Chris, I really think you should, in your museum, have something about birds. And Chris has been an advocate and supporter ever since, and he brought his very considerable influence and staff to bear on this project. And here are some people spreading their wings who did all of the creative execution of the exhibit. Julian, Retta, Senda is a graphic illustrator. Patrick Cam, Cody Otout, and Peter Nelson all had roles in putting together the exhibit that you will see later today. Sarah Knights, the outreach education coordinator, looked at all of the questions that I'd written. We have, kids will be pleased to know that on every exhibit there are questions primarily targeted to kids. And your parents will give you an extremely nice prize if you get all the questions' answers right. Sarah told me when my questions were dumb and unanswerable or unintelligible, and so hopefully they are now somewhat better. You will have seen on the announcement that this is a collaborative exhibit with the University of Washington's Burke Museum. A great museum on the northwest corner of the UW campus here in Seattle. And we've had tremendous help from particularly Rob Fawcett, who is the collections manager of ornithology, and two people on his staff, Eugene and Kevin. Here's Rob doing what he does best, look, with a dead bird. And they have, Eugene in particular, mounted the magnificent skeleton of the great owl that you'll see in the exhibit. And we'll be talking about the herons. When I asked Rob if we could have some herons for the exhibit, he said, oh, I've got a freezer full of dead herons. Must be the only guy in the country who's got a freezer full of dead herons, but he came through for us. I also want to acknowledge Sarah Drummond, who's not here today, but she will be coming in a week or two. I met Sarah on a cruise to Alaska where she was the naturalist. She is also an illustrator, and Sarah is responsible for all of the illustrations that you will see in the exhibit today. Now, I want today to give you a quick preview of the exhibit. I then will introduce you to a special guest that we have, and we'll have a little live flying excitement here in the auditorium, and hopefully not too exciting. And we will then talk about some of the panels in detail. It won't be too boring, I hope, for the kids. We'll talk a little bit about just how it is that birds fly. I'll tell you a few flight stories. We'll talk about the debt that powered flight owes to the study of bird flight. And I'll finish with a little discussion of bird photography, because I know many of you are photographers and are interested in photography. And I'll tell you, I've set up over here the setup for one particular photograph that we will see as we go through. So let's start here. So this is one of the graphics where As you go into the exhibit, this is what you'll see first, and it shows the tremendous diversity in the avian kingdom. This represents just about the whole range. In the bottom right, and the smallest bird here, you see is a small purple-throated white star hummingbird that weighs about as much as a sugar cube and has a 4-inch wingspan. And on the other extreme, you see the 7'6" wingspan of the whooping crane, which I have had the joy of photographing down at the Aransas National Wildlife Refuge in Texas. And the purpose of this exhibit, it didn't need any explaining. When we opened the exhibit yesterday afternoon, within 30 seconds, this young man was trying out his wingspan. It works perfectly. It's magnetic. He turned out to be just a little bigger than an American crow. Now, as you go through the exhibit, and this is where the dead herons come in, look up and you will see a representation of this bird, which is a bird taking off on Fisherman Bay and Lopez Island. We have reproduced 6 different wing postures from this takeoff sequence, beautiful takeoff sequence of this bird, very noisy takeoff, and a magnificent example of how this bird is getting lift and raising off from the water. I've mentioned that one of the exhibits is the skeleton of a great horned owl. Of course, I want you to look at the wings and the very interesting proportion of the different parts of the wing in this bird, particularly the hand. And we'll talk about the hand and how the hand is specialized in birds. But you have to look, and they will be looking at you, at the eyes. Absolutely amazing eyes. The eyes of the great horned owl are actually cylinders rather than eyeballs, and they don't rotate the way our eyeballs do. It has that wonderful neck that allows it to look anywhere. But per body size, the great horned owl's eyes are larger than any terrestrial vertebrate. So it's a magnificent skeleton, and take a look at it in some detail. And there's another bone here I want you to look at that we'll briefly talk about, and it's this keel or sternum. This is an absolutely critical bone in the evolution of bird flight because it's the bone to which the flight muscles are attached. It sticks right out where we have a sternum. The keel or carina sticks right out to give leverage to these flight muscles. And we'll meet a bird that doesn't have a keel like that and actually doesn't fly. We've got a number of high-speed videos, and I'm going to show some of them here now, given by my colleagues Andy Bewiener and Brent Tobalski, Andy at Harvard and Brett at Montana. An absolutely vertical takeoff of peregrine falcon. Now this is a mixture of both hydrodynamics and aerodynamics. Look at this bird flapping the water. And then some aerodynamics to follow the hydrodynamics. This is from Andy Bewiener's lab. In biomechanics, we often put markers on things. Look at the markers on this pigeon. Every wing has got a target on it. This is an interesting example of a different gait. This bird is using a flap glide cycle. So he'll flap a little, then he'll glide a little, and of course he'll go down, and he'll flap a little more, and glide a little. And it's interesting to point out that birds don't fly the same way all the time. They fly in many different ways. As everyone who flies a plane knows, landing is potentially the most terrifying experience in flight. The plane will take off itself, but landing is much more complex, and birds find the same thing. Look at this tentative, multiple adjustments as the pigeon comes into land here, ending perfectly with its feet on the perch. So those are in a video stand that we have in the exhibit, and that was a very popular item yesterday. Another of the videos tells the story that you may have heard of Operation Migration, where a group of people at the Crane Center in Wisconsin have trained the almost extinct whooping crane to follow an ultralight in its migration to Florida. And the idea here was to split the two populations to minimize the risk. And so once these birds have learned the route by following the ultralight, that's where they'll migrate for the rest of their lives. And it's a lovely little video about that operation and that story. You will also see a zoetrope, and a zoetrope is a very simple rotating slot device that was invented in the mid-19th century before there were movie cameras. And one of the interesting things about this is that this video is composed of simply 12 individual tracings. And isn't it remarkable that the brain will merge these 12 tracings together into what looks like a continuous pattern? I'll come back to this because we're going to talk about flapping flight a little bit, and there's some really interesting pointers to flapping flight in that particular video. Another feature that we have in the Education Center is the Burke Museum has given us both wings and feathers. So kids, make sure you go and look at these, because you can actually hold a whole bird wing. It's remarkable when you do that because it doesn't weigh anything. And it gives you the notion of just how remarkable the bird flight is on these fragile wings. We have a number of nest cams. I don't think I'm on the web here, but this one is at the Chesapeake Bay in Maryland. There's an osprey on a nest that they've just returned to from migration. Ospreys are long-distance migrators. We'll talk a little more about migration. And there's also a rufous hummingbird, a really remarkable nest cam on the hummingbird. And you can actually measure its heart rate because it's sitting there going bub, 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 bub. So take a look at that. Now, another feature that we have, one of the things I'm going to talk to you about is how birds have influenced flight and influenced the design of aircraft. But we have in the exhibit an ornithopter. And an ornithopter is a bird wing. It's an aircraft that flies by flapping its wings. And I want to now introduce to you a guest who is here today, Ben Piepenburg. Ben is a master's candidate in aeronautical engineering at Penn State University, and he's currently working at AeroVironment just outside Los Angeles, where there's a lot of interest in ornithopters and other flying vehicles. So Ben, come and tell us a little bit about ornithopters, and let's have some fun.
Okay, thank you. Can you all hear me? A little bit? Okay. So, as Peter said, I am a master's candidate, and I'm also working right now as an aerospace engineer. And my work revolves around robotic birds, or ornithopters. And so I wanted to give you a demonstration of one of these vehicles. And I'll talk a little bit about how it works when I get it up in the air. And so these are all electric powered. And if it comes near you, don't worry, it weighs half an ounce, and it really won't be able to hurt you. Half an ounce is about the same as 3 pennies. Kind of get an idea. So this vehicle has 2 sets of flapping wings. And the one in the picture behind me that's in the exhibit only has 1 set. It flies very similar to a bird. This one is a little bit slower than that. And this robotic bird, ornithopter, flies just like a big airplane. It doesn't look like it has an airfoiled wing, but actually when the wings are under tension and they're flapping, they create lift just the same way that an airplane wing would. And they also create thrust by the angle that they're striking the air.
Could you fly this little one for us, Ben?
Yes, absolutely.
He's got a very tiny one that I wanted to show you. And tell us why these might be useful then to in the real world.
Right. So as airplanes get smaller and smaller, they become useful for a number of different reasons. A few of the applications right now that people are looking at are for military surveillance. That's perhaps the least interesting. But there's a number of applications in things like firefighting. If you wanted to go inside of a building and it's not safe for humans, you could send in a small vehicle like this. And so there's a lot of research being done right now on how perhaps we can build these vehicles and make them really useful for humanity. And so that's what my research is as an engineer.
How much does this one weigh?
This one weighs less than 1 pound. So he's asking if you would calculate the vertical tail volume or the horizontal tail volume in the same way that you would on a normal airplane. The answer is yes, if I had calculated it, which I did not. I just honestly built several of them, and when it worked well, I stopped.
Is that how to go? 787?
And actually, the wing area is a very similar kind of an issue. And I built them oversized from what I thought would work, and I took a pair of scissors and I started cutting. And when it all seemed to be working pretty well, that was my design.
Well, Ben, thanks so much indeed for
you.
coming. So make sure you take a look at Ben's swallow, as he calls it, that's in a plexiglass box in the display. Now, let me talk to you a little bit about navigating the panels in the exhibit. So that we have what we call standard panels that have got a similar format. And let me show you one of them, which is a panel about how birds land. It's interesting that birds have perfected something that's usually very bad news when you're flying, and that's stalling. Birds almost always stall before they land, and they exploit stalling. And this exhibit talks to you about that. We, first of all, have a text which links to the picture. The picture in this case is a glossy ibis that was photographed in Botswana, and it points you to look at a feature on the picture that illustrates the flight concept that we're talking of. In this case, we're talking about stall, and the way you can tell this bird is stalling is that the wings on the back of the feathers on the wing, instead of being smooth, they're ruffled. And so there is a separation of the flow as it goes across the wing, and you've got the bird is in a stall mode. There is a secondary discussion about landing. In this case, it's about birds landing on water in the second panel. Now, the captions to each of the pictures tell you what the bird is, its name, its Latin name. They tell you where it was taken, and some photographic details, which I'll talk about just at the end. There is a fact about the bird, nothing necessarily to do with flight, but for those of you who are interested in birds more than you are in flight, it's a fact about the bird. And in this case, it's about where you can find this bird. You can find some of these birds actually in the United States. They came here on the trade winds. We then, and here's the quiz, kids, this is to test your bird IQ. This is a question, not necessarily a quiz on the material. It could be something brand new. This one, for example, says, why do airplanes need long runways to land? So, Aiden, think about that. Okay. There is a QR code on each exhibit, and if you scan the QR code with your smartphone, it will take you to my website, and it actually will not take you to the front page. It will take you right into the exhibit page. For example, here is the evolution page that we're going to talk about, and it'll give you a little extra information, or if you want to just read what you've read about or read more about it, you can find it there. And I've got some cards here that I'm going to just leave out on the stage, and you can find all my social media coordinates on the card. On some of the specimens, we will have an actual bird wing, and this is what Rob and his colleagues at the Burke have helped us. This is the fixed wing of a white American white pelican, remarkable bird. Now, when you look at these wings, they are fixed. And remember that the huge difference between birds and airplanes is that most airplanes, can do very little to change the configuration of their wings. Yes, they have ailerons, and there have been planes that warp the wings, but birds are infinitely variable. They can change their shape. They can change their center of mass. They can change their center of lift. They can change their wingspan. And so these fixed wings are great for you to get the notion of all of the anatomy and the beauty of the wing. But in flight, of course, they are flexible things that birds exploit to the maximum. So that's the layout of the exhibit, what you can find in the exhibit, how you can look at the panels, and what you can find on the panels. So let's go in now and look at, I've chosen a few of the panels to talk to you about. And this is where it all begins. This is the first bird, the Archaeopteryx, the first wing. And this happens to be the Thermopolis Archaeopteryx. There have been about less than 20 of these birds found throughout the world. The first was found in 1860 and caused a great deal of controversy because that was just at the time of Darwin's theory of evolution coming. It's the size of a crow, approximately. It has teeth, not like present-day birds who do not have teeth. And it's generally thought to have evolved from a theropod dinosaur. And so this is now no longer controversial that dinosaurs had feathers and that dinosaurs were the origin of birds and that bird flight begun in one way or another. That is open to debate. Whether birds took to the air by climbing trees and launching off, whether they actually took to the air by running fast so they could get lift, or whether they first ran up trees, as some birds do today. That's all open to debate. But this is generally acknowledged to be the first bird. And this is the very best specimen, and you can actually see this specimen at the Thermopolis Dinosaur Museum in Wyoming, where it now resides. Flying has actually appeared 4 separate times in the evolution of the Earth. It appeared first in insects, then in pterosaurs, then in bats, and finally in birds. And each one of those were totally unrelated. They were responses to the need to do things that we'll talk about later. And so each time it's evolved in a different way. And every time the hand has been involved in a different and important way. Look at the pterosaur. The pterosaur's wing is completely suspended from the pinky. That whole massive wing. The largest pterosaur has a wingspan of 35 feet, found in Texas. And that is all suspended from one elongated pinky. In the bat, on the other hand, the wing, the membrane, is suspended from an elongation of every single finger except the thumb. In the bird, what's happened is that most of the bones of the hand have coalesced into a single fused bone of the middle finger. And the thumb is, as an exhibit will tell you, has a couple of wings attached to it, special wings called the alula, which do some really interesting aerodynamic things. But the hand has fused into just one or a couple of bones, but the wrist is still the very most important joint in the bird, for reasons which we'll mention when we talk about flapping. The flight muscles of the bird, as I previously mentioned, are attached to this big keel that comes out from the sternum. And there's some very interesting things about the flight muscles. You know all about flight muscles, because when you eat turkey breast, that's what you're eating. Those are turkey flight muscles, although it doesn't fly very well. The wing depressors are the muscles that bring the wings down in the power stroke. The wing elevators bring them back. Now, notice the first thing you see is that the elevators are just a half or a quarter of the size of the depressors, and that's because birds can depend on drag to get the wings back up. If they just put their wings in the right direction, they don't need a muscle to recover the wings. Air drag will do it for them. The other very interesting thing, and I know there's a couple of anatomists in the audience, is that both these muscles, which we would anatomically call antagonists, are on the same side of the joint. It would be like having your biceps and triceps right in front of your arm. And that's because you want the bird's wings to be low, a bit like a high-wing aircraft. You want the weight to be low underneath the wings. And so what happens is that the wing elevator muscles go over a little pulley over the shoulder. So you have them in the same place to begin with, but a little pulley changes their direction. So really interesting anatomy of the bird wings. Now, a very simplified description of the feathers, the outer 10 feathers on the wing, which is sometimes called the hand wing, are the primary feathers. The inner wing, and we've got about 10 here, but that's very variable between species. A wandering albatross that has a huge wing has about 25 secondary feathers. In general terms, the primaries on the hand wing, as we shall discuss, are responsible for thrust, and the secondaries, the inboard ones, are responsible for lift. Okay, kids, it's time for some physics. So here is a bird, one of my favorite birds actually, and I just saw this bird for the first time in February. It's a Steller's sea eagle. Gliding along, I want to know what forces are acting on this bird. Anybody, kid, tell me one force that's acting. Gravity, perfect. That's the one I wanted first because I think that's it. So we've got gravity, and the force of weight is trying to bring this bird out of the sky. What is stopping that happening? Yes? The wings, that's right, because the wings are doing that. The wings are producing lift. Now, what other forces are happening to this bird? What's trying to slow this bird down? How about you? Wow. Get that man an ice cream. Drag. So there is the force of drag trying to slow this bird down. And why isn't it slowing down? The answer is thrust. So the bird itself is producing thrust to stop being slowed down. So here we have the situation where two outside forces are acting on the bird, drag and weight, and the bird is producing thrust and lift so that it can go where it wants to go. So let's quickly look at those two things. Here is an American white pelican, and you can see in the diagram that what happens is as the airflow separates over the front of the wing, slow air goes along the bottom, fast air goes across the top, and that causes a lifting action that lifts this bird up. Now, a couple of things about lift. Birds absolutely do not need to flap to create lift. I have seen birds, for example, at the Dungeness Spit, strong wind coming in, they simply put their wings out and up they go because the flow of the air over their wings is absolutely sufficient to produce lift more than their weight. And when that happens, up they go. The very interesting thing about lift is that it increases drastically with the speed of the airflow. For those nerds amongst you, it's a direct square relationship. So if you increase the speed of the air by 2, you increase the lift by 4. Increase the speed by 3, the lift by 9. So you get lots of lift with more speed. And that's why birds like to sit on the top of trees. Because when they take off, they just use gravity to get their speed, open their wings, and they've got lift. They don't need to flap. And another very interesting thing about lift is that it's always accompanied by drag. Now, this is the downside. So you can't have lift without drag. You can't have one without the other. And lift good, drag bad, because you've got to overcome it with thrust. So let's talk about drag. A lot of different kinds of drag. This is a yellow-legged seagull on a ferry in Holland who is waiting for people to throw little bits of food to it. And it's got lots of drag. It's got profile drag because it's got a big area it's facing to the wind. Look at this bird. This is a northern gannet taken at Bass Rock in Scotland. What an absolutely perfect aerodynamic structure that bird is. Many adaptations to this bird make it, this is a diving bird. When it feeds, it plunges from a height, and it makes itself into a guided missile. And you can see that it's got both a wonderful profile, and the other kind of drag we're introducing here is drag due to friction as the air rides over the surface of the wing. Now there's a third kind of drag called induced drag, and this is, you can't have lift without drag. This is the one that's got that relationship, because as normally the fast air and the slow air move across the wing, at the end of the wingtip, the air from underneath the wing that's moving rapidly is trying to come up over the edge of the wing, and what that does is it creates a vortex. You'll see that in a moment. And that's the induced drag that is dependent on the size of the wing. And birds, as you might guess, depending upon their lifestyle, have got different ways of managing how much lift they get and how much drag is imposed. And back to the albatross. Albatrosses sometimes go on food foraging trips of 1,500 miles. Can you imagine going 1,500 miles for breakfast? But they do it. And they bring food back after a 15-mile trip. So efficiency for them is absolutely critical to their survival. So they have long wings, what are called high aspect ratio wings, that have very little drag for the area of the wing. So birds have figured it out how to make the most of lift and drag. Now let's talk about flapping. This is a sandhill crane photographed at the Bosque de la Pace Wildlife Refuge in New Mexico. Now, the outer wing, the hand wing we talked about, is the primary generator of thrust. It also generates lift, but it's the primary generator of thrust. When you ask kids typically how do birds fly, they will say like this. Well, that's actually not what happens. If I turn sideways, way flapping occurs is like this. It's downwards and forwards. And it's that downwards and forwards that allows thrust to be created. Because you know there's lift from the wing this way, so if I turn my wing, a part of the lift is going to be in that direction. And you can see that here, that the lift lifts me up, but if I turn my wings, then the thrust is going to drive me forward. Now, this would all be for nothing if the bird brought the wing back in the same way, because it would get thrust forward on the way down, thrust backwards on the way back, and it would never go anywhere because the thrust would cancel out. And so this is very analogous to the situation in another kind of aircraft. But I'm showing you this again so you can see how that wing is actually driven downwards and forwards, right? And it's the primaries that are giving the bird its drive forward. So you can think of lift as being just the same as an airplane. And we show you some different kinds of airfoils and lift in the exhibit. It turns out that early airplanes copied birds. But then, as soon as people realized that aerodynamics actually had differences depending upon the scale of the object, they changed. But thrust is much more like a helicopter. And what happens, if you've ever thought about how a helicopter can go forwards, is that there is a control called a cyclic on a helicopter that actually tilts the helicopter blade forward when it's on the forward stroke. And on the back, it turns it the other way. And so for birds, lift is like a plane, thrust is like a helicopter. All right, let's talk about a couple of really advanced flyers. This is a picture I wish I'd taken. I have envy about this picture. This was taken by Marcus Unsold, who was a photographer on an experiment by Stephen Portugal, who is a bird researcher at the University of London. These were very rare birds. These birds were in danger of extinction, and this is another of those cases where ornithologists used ultralights to guide these birds to a new migration target. But the issue that Portugal was exploring here is this fascinating thing of formation. When you're up in Skagit County in the winter and you look up and you see these skeins of geese in this wonderful formation, we always say, yes, they're benefiting some way from following. But until only last year was it really understood how they're benefiting. And what Portugal found out, and here on this diagram, you see the lead bird in the left-hand corner, and you see in the dotted lines the sweet spot where the vortex that's shed from that wing has got an updraft to it. Remember I showed you how the induced drag causes a vortex. And so part of that vortex is falling and part of it is rising. So what birds have learned to do in migration is they've learned to find where is that portion of the vortex that's rising and where's the portion that's falling. And the red cloud there is the number of wing beats that hit the sweet spot. And you can see that in a 7-minute flight period, which this was, that bird had the majority of its wing flaps in the sweet zone where it was going to benefit from the rising vortex of the lead bird. Now, of course, the question of who's leading is an interesting one, and these birds actually rotate. They switch off, just like riders in a pursuit race on a bicycle. And that's to be studied a little more, but this paper was in Nature last year. Now, there's another picture I wish I'd taken. This is by Owen Humphreys, who is a British news photographer. And this is not a UFO. This is a group of starlings flying, flocking. And this looks like a brain, doesn't it? There's another one he's got where it looks like the Concorde taking off. And these birds aggregate and fly in this manner. It's thought they do it for protection because a peregrine falcon coming at that lot wouldn't know quite what to do. That's what they think, I guess. But how do they do it? That's the question. The why, we're not quite sure, but the how, you can guess that people who do mathematical models have really loved this problem. And so they've taken this as a challenge to see how few rules they could find that would create a flock like this. And the most famous model, rather humorously, is called Boyd's, like these are New York birds. And the Boyd's model has only 3 rules. And if you stick to these 3 rules, you can make a flock, and they've made a flock. The movie Batman Returns had an animated flock of birds, and it used the Boyd's rules. So Boyd's rule number 1 is give your neighbor space. So fly a trajectory so that you are equally spaced from all your neighbors. That makes sense. You don't want to bump into anybody. Second rule is steer in the same average direction as your surrounding neighbors. So once you've got the space, look at them all, figure out which way they're going, and you fly in that average direction. Number 3, as long as rule number 2 is being satisfied, is fly towards the average position of your neighbors. Now, this is kind of more complicated and less intuitive. In rule 1, you keep away from them. In rule 3, you fly towards them. But in these 3 rules, you put those into a model, and you get an amazing-looking bird flock, just like the real thing. Now, we don't know that birds use these rules. We just know that these rules result in flocking. But it's a good chance that they do, because these are all rules that can be validated through visual perception. Let's talk about another advanced flying technique. This is an Arctic tern. I met this bird in the lowlands of Holland in the spring, and it was in the middle of migrating. This bird is the world champion migrator of any species that exists. The map you see here shows you in yellow what the outward spring migration of the Arctic tern is, and in white you see the fall migration. So this bird, for some reason, which I'll mention briefly, spends its whole life flying from the Arctic to the Antarctic, to the Arctic, to the Antarctic. That's all it does. In a 30-year lifetime, this bird flies the equivalent of 3 times to the moon and back. Amazing amazing achievement for this bird. Now, a couple of interesting things you notice. Notice the yellow is split into two, and notice that the yellow sticks to the coasts. Why is that? Well, in the spring, they're flying with young birds, and these birds are not such great flyers as the established birds. So they're going to fly closer to the coast, take some naps, take some rests, and make sure there's lots of food. Also, on the way back, they migrate back twice as fast as they migrate down. And that's, again, because the young birds have grown up, and they're strong flyers now, and they can keep up with the adults. So they have round trips of 50,000 miles. They take half the time to return and 3 times to the moon and back. Certainly, the hummingbird is an expert flyer. This little beauty is a purple-throated white star. I mentioned him to you already, taken in Tandayapa in the foothills of the Andes in Ecuador. Now, hummingbird flight is characterized by and enabled by a number of things. This bird has a uniquely specialized shoulder. It has a shoulder that has much more mobility than any other bird. And it's, whereas I mentioned the wrist was the important joint in almost every other bird, in the hummingbird, the action is in the shoulder. It's also a very wasteful bird, a very wasteful way to fly. Per kilogram, or I should say gram body weight, this bird uses more energy than any other organism on the planet. It's an extremely inefficient flyer. It has to feed all the time to make up for this. And it's one of the few birds that generates lift, to keep it up, on both the forward stroke and the backstroke. More on the forward stroke than the backstroke, but what it does with this mobile shoulder is it does a figure of 8. It goes forward and backwards, forwards and backwards. And it has an extremely complex aerodynamics to its flight pattern. And I mentioned to Steve, this is the one for you. I don't know where you are, but Steve's an aerodynamicist there who's been helpful to me in some discussions. And I only came across this. This is not in the exhibit. I only came across this last week. This is a remarkable computational dynamics film from some researchers at Vanderbilt University. So here you see a high-speed movie. You see that figure of 8 that I was mentioning. And look at this. Look at the complexity of the airflow over this bird's wing. You can see where the flow is attached sometimes during the forward stroke. This is what they call simplified. If this is simple, wow. And now, here is the complex of it. So this simple beauty that we see is actually underpinned by this remarkable complexity of moving air vortices and shedding vortices and interaction of the forward stroke and the backstroke. And it's not really understood. This is the threshold of understanding of bird flight, and there's really still a long way to go. Now, what about this character? I met this character on a remarkable island, the most pristine of the Galapagos Islands, called Fernandina. And this is a real paradox to me because this bird was certainly seen by Darwin. The Galapagos Islands have only been above the water for 3 to 5 million years, and Darwin definitely saw this bird. This is a flightless cormorant. Its body looks exactly like the 2 other cormorant species from which the genetics now shows it came from, and that is the neotropical cormorant and the double-crested cormorant, but it doesn't fly. Now, it's such a perfect example of natural selection that it's stunning to me that Darwin didn't talk about this, but he didn't, so let us talk about it. Why does a bird need to fly? There are 3 main reasons. The first is to get food. Well, this bird just has to throw itself off this lava here, and the sea is rich with food. So has no need to fly for food. Migration. Well, migration allows you to live somewhere in the summer that wouldn't be good to live in the winter. But the climate's perfect here all year round. So that one's out the window. The last one is to escape. Well, this bird has no predators. So you can see that the 3 main reasons why a bird flies don't apply to this bird at all. So over the very brief period of 3 to 5 million years, this bird has lost the ability to fly. And there are many other flightless species. Many of them, of course, have been decimated by the introduction of predators and humans and human hunting. This bird has no human predators. It's lucky enough to live in a national park. So it's a very interesting story of flight that's been lost. Now, coming towards the end, let us finally talk about some of the people who have been influenced by bird flight. And Leonardo da Vinci is a good place to start. Da Vinci wrote a complete codex on the flight of birds. And some of you may have been fortunate enough to see the exhibit at the Smithsonian Institution in 2013, where for the first time this codex left Italy. It's about 12 to 15 double-spaced pages, typical Leonardo, with occasionally an anatomical drawing of something else and some sketches, and it's all in this wonderful mirror writing. And it was written between 1505 and 1506, and we have a page, not the page, but we have a facsimile page from that codex in the exhibit here. Leonardo was actually not only interested in humans flying. He wanted to take bird flight and make human flight, but as any other person who has got great ambition, he was interested in the glory that would come if he was the person that figured out how to let humans fly. He talked about how there would be everlasting glory from the nest from which this great bird came. He strove, like all the rest of us, for some recognition. And here's the page, look, with some birds. There are about 70 illustrations of birds. They are likely to be black kites, because that's the hawk that was in the region that Da Vinci was writing. Another great influencer of human-powered flight, and we were just talking about this one before, this is a turkey vulture, remarkably ugly bird. Look, it's one of those birds that's got no hair on its head so that all the blood and guts from its breakfast doesn't get caught on the feathers. It's entirely a bird that feasts on carrion. It has a remarkable sense of smell, which most birds do not have. But the influence of this bird is on this individual, Wilbur Wright. And Wilbur Wright was a very prolific correspondent. And in 1900, before first flight, he wrote to Octave Chanute, another aviation pioneer, that he'd been watching buzzards, and they'd been having trouble with their gliders at Kitty Hawk. Every time the gliders hit a gust of side wind, they would crash. They had no way of controlling them in gusty winds. And he figured out by watching a turkey vulture that this bird seems to warp its wings. And we talked a little bit about that earlier. Bird wings are not static. And so lo and behold, the Wright brothers patented a wing warping system. Here's a sketch where you can see it more. And if you look at the Wright flyer outside, you will see that there are ropes that go diagonally across the wing. And as the pilot was flying, they would tug on a rope and the wing would warp. And for a few years, that became the way aircraft were controlled under those circumstances. It didn't last. We have ailerons now to do that kind of stuff. But that was the way the Wright brothers figured it out. Now, the last pioneer I want to talk to you grew up looking at birds like this. This is a maguari stork. I photographed this in the Pantanal in Brazil. But a very close relative of this bird migrates to Germany. And an aviation pioneer called Otto Lilienthal here grew up watching these storks. And he and his brother tried to fly, building wings when they were only 9 and 10 years old. It's a great story. He wrote a book called, let's see, what is it actually called? It's called, in translation, it's called something like Bird Flight and Aviation. And from a very early age, he was interested in bird flight. He grew up to be a card-carrying engineer. And he was convinced that birds flew by pushing down on the air. Aerodynamics at that time was not fully understood. And he was confirmed in that idea by this gadget. Here is a multi-wing device that, as he pedaled it, those wings went up and down. And you can see that this was 80 kilograms. him and the contraption, and when he put a 40-kilogram weight on there, he was able to get off the ground. But he was wrong in this, and he was also wrong in thinking that he could build flapping wings. Here's one of his wing flapping devices, that he could flap it with his arms and get off the ground. Now, most of us can make mistakes and get away with it. But unfortunately for Lilienthal, he did not get away with it, and he stalled while he was flying. Amazingly, the instruction on his grave says, "Sacrifices must be made." Well, I suppose he sacrificed for the rest of us to understand aviation. The final up-to-date example of birds influencing air flight and present-day flight is shown here. You can't fail to have noticed that in the last 15 to 20 years, aircraft no longer have straight wings. They have devices on the end that are sticking up at various angles. Some of them are multiple. Some go up, some go down. And here you see a Caspian tern on Lopez Island who has just caught this sculpin, flying off with it. And you see that on the downstroke, his wings have got winglets on them. Now, we have a Caspian tern wing in the exhibit, and it's flat. But that, again, tells you that wings adapt when the bird flies. Now, what's going on here? Well, it's been shown that what happens here is that this tends to attenuate this trailing vortex and reduces the energy that the bird is putting into the air and wasting it. And so, in fact, winglets have been credited on aircraft for reducing the fuel requirements by somewhere around 3%, 3 to 4%. And it's the same in birds. The Caspian tern is a migrator, does a long-distance flight, and if it can reduce the energy that it wastes, it's very good for its survival. All right, so I'm going to finish up here, and I'm just going to say a few words about bird photography, for those of you who are interested in bird photography. So bird photography is nice because it lets you go to interesting places. That's one of the really good things. This is taken in the Galapagos Islands, and it actually, at that moment, I actually took this photograph of a blue-footed booby plunging into the water. But I wanted to show you the setup that was used to take the picture of the violet, of the purple-throated white star. Here you see a bird that came visiting me in my backyard on Lopez. This is a rufous hummingbird. Now, look at the speed here. It was taken at 1/5000th of a second, but the wing is blurry. So you don't often have enough light to go faster than a 5,000th of a second, but some of the hummingbird pictures I've shown you, the wings are clear. And here is this little guy. Now, look at the paradox here. This was taken at a 250th of a second with a tiny, tiny aperture, not letting hardly any light in. But the key is it was taken with 4 strobes. And that's the setup that I have over here, if you'd like to come and look at it later. And you can tell that. Here I've blown up the bird's eye for you. And look, 1, 2, 3, 4. You can see the reflections of my strobes in the bird's eye. And so sometimes it's a matter of just a camera and a lens, but other times that's the rig that I carried with me to Ecuador on that particular expedition. So you can see that sometimes you need a little more tech to get the photograph that you want. I hope you enjoy the exhibit. I'm going to leave some cards here. You can come and pick one up, and you can look at my website, and you can write me about anything, any questions you have about the exhibit. And I thank you for listening, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter.